Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. As we begin this session of the Inclusive Summit, our inaugural Inclusive Summit, we would like to thank you for participating. Thank you for joining us for this summit. This is an exciting time. We're discussing addressing emotional and structural barriers. We have with us today Dr. Dean Aslania, who is currently serving as the Associate Dean of Psychology and Human Services program in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Phoenix. Dr. Aslania is a licensed psychotherapist in both the state of Arizona and Texas. He has more than 15 years of clinical counseling experiences, ranging from treating individuals to families and couples. Next, we have with us Dr. Jane Schumacher, who serves as the lead faculty area chair currently for the College of Doctoral Studies and the Educational Leadership Program. She is a university administrator, dissertation chair, doctoral instructor, and faculty coach. Um, I will give them a chance to share a little bit more about themselves. I am Dr. Lilia Santiago. I will be moderating the session for us. So today, our session is really highlighting the many emotional and structural barriers students and leaders face in our education system. The sessions will focus on both higher education and K-12. We will take a moment first with Dr. Aslina to talk about the emotional and structural barriers in higher education, the need for diversity and inclusion. The second portion of our session, Dr. Schumacher will present Becoming Inclusive Leaders by Addressing Emotional and Structural Barriers. We'll have an opportunity to engage you as audience and participant, and we'll have moments for Q&A at the end. So at this time, I would like to turn over the stage to Dr. Slinia to begin our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santiago. Welcome to everyone. I hope everybody can hear me well and see the picture on the screen okay. First and foremost, I just want to take a moment and thank all the volunteers we've had for this wonderful Inclusive Leadership Summit, as well as all the administrators that have so smoothly so far delivered this summit. It's an honor to be speaking with you for the next 45 minutes in my case, and I hope to have an engaging conversation with all of you so that we can hopefully all learn a little bit from one another and what we're doing in our respective fields, depending on wherever you might be. I will try to keep my topics and points as broad as possible. However, my main focus will be um, addressing emotional and structural barriers in higher education. Obviously, many of the topics I'm going to address are going to be based in the United States system. I understand we have many audience members that might be abroad, so take that where it may apply. But I would certainly love to hear more from each of you in terms of your questions and or comments and feedback that you might have. We do have moderators who are monitoring the chat room, so if any questions come up during the presentation, feel free to type those in and they will get those to me, and hopefully I can address them um, as they come up. So, with that said, we can go on to the next slide. And so, first, we've done the welcomes and introduction. I will tell you a little bit more as it applies to my background. However, we'll do an overview of the current barriers in higher education and many of the hurdles students and learners, adult learners, have to um, overcome to be able to gain the education that they're seeking and to move into the newer positions that they might strive for. Then at that point, we will turn into speaking about actually the need for diversity and inclusion. Over the past 2 days, you've heard many sessions um, highlighting what makes it important for diverse groups of people to be included and how to accommodate many different groups of individuals, students, and learners. However, I think one conversation that we should also add on to that those is how that diversity, how the inclusion of these individuals from the many different walks of life enhances our dialogue, enhances our education, enhances the um, mode of operation that we're in. And so we'll definitely talk about that. Then we get into some discussions and questions, and hopefully we'll have some possible takeaways and solutions that you can take and apply to whatever your setting of work might be or your campus, be it K through 12 or higher ed. The Dr. Schumacher is going to speak more on the through 12 level, and I will be focusing on the higher education side. So, with that said, if we can go to the next slide, please. All right. So, in terms of higher education in the United States, just to give you a little bit more of a background and my familiarity with this topic. So, I've gained or obtained six different degrees in the US, ranging all the way from associates all the way to a doctor's, a few masters in between. So, I've gone and happily or gladly have gone through all the different stages um, at different institutions. I've had the experience of going and obtaining my Associates of Science in a community college, then transferring to a Tier 1 school where I got my Bachelor's of Science in Psychology, then moving on and getting a Master's in Psychology and then another one in Counseling from Texas A&M Commerce. Um, and so it's been a mixture, and I'm about to complete an MBA here at the University of Phoenix as well. So I've had the experience of being at public small institutions at the community college level, at a public tier one institution that's very large, at a private university. I've taught at five different universities myself over the past 2 decades, both in the online space as well as the traditional brick and mortar type schools. And so I've become intimately familiar with many of the barriers that students face, not only as a student myself, but also as a faculty member and then as now as an administrator. And so many of the barriers that students face in the US start off with oftentimes access, and that being financial burden of the university or the academic process. And again, oftentimes it becomes an intimidating path. I myself am a first generation um, university graduate, if you will, in my family. And obviously, I went through the entire gamut. However, it was not without its turbulations and or um, unknown paths of discovery. I had to learn how to manage the process. I had to figure out how to get financial aid. I had to figure out how to obtain scholarships. But once you learn that process, you can finally do away with that as a burden or a barrier. But until then, the anxiety or the burden of how am I going to get to school when it costs so much money becomes usually the first barrier. And unfortunately, often the barrier that stops many students from even taking the next steps to even challenge the system or to see if they can even obtain. I paid for every single penny of my education myself, one way or another, whether it was for me working since the age of 16 or if it was by me obtaining scholarships and or working at universities that actually paid some of my tuition for me, and of course the student loans that I've had to pay back to the government for allowing me the opportunity to go to school. So regardless of what that situation might look like, financial burdens are a major barrier that many students face regardless of age. So that's one of those areas that we as industry leaders, as individuals in positions where we can make a change, should continue to strive to create more access. I know there are many countries that public education and higher education is free, and that's been a public or a political talking point here in the United States of whether that's a possible feat or not. I remember reading an article that Scandinavian countries, if you are a criminal and go to jail, you have to ultimately pay for that jail time. So they will give you loans while they put you in the jail, but by the time you come back, or through the journey of that sentence, you have to work for it and pay back the loan of the room and board that they're providing you in the jail system. Conversely, their higher education is free. It's ironic in the States, it's completely opposite. We allow the prisoners or criminals to get fed and be housed for free, but then we make our students or the more productive sect of society have to bear the burden of their education. Now, I will leave that there. I don't want to open up a controversial political conversation, but nevertheless, just the different viewpoints on how different countries operate and where they put their priorities. So, anyway, financial burdens and lack of financial ability is one of those barriers that often keeps students from being able to come to a higher education system. The other one that's much more manageable is oftentimes our application and acceptance process. You know, many times we have many different tests, standardized testing, the SATs, the LSATs, the MCATs, what have you, that gauge what a student's success rate for would be for the first year of that program. Obviously, uh, these tests create both a benefit for the university to be able to decide who they want to admit into their program, but it also disenfranchises many who may not be as familiar or who may not have the ability to prep for those tests like some others in society. And so that's another way for us as industry leaders to begin to look at, are we giving fair access to students by simply utilizing standardized tests? There are many research articles that highlight how standardized testing often discriminate against minorities and women in particular because of the range of access, again, many times in the prep process and familiarity with those tests. And so, again, I realize there are very competitive universities out there that have to develop tiering systems of how they will eliminate applicants to finally land there in their acceptance pool. But then there are other institutions that try to be much more inclusive and to give actually access to the minority groups or the disenfranchised. So, one of the ways that I know here at the University of Phoenix we have achieved that was when I was actually the program chair for our counseling program in the Phoenix campus, and our counseling graduate program actually has the highest national accreditation that is possible for any counseling program to have, which is CACREP accreditation. Um, and I know we had gotten some major kudos from them when on our last site review when they were looking at our admissions process for our masters in the counseling program. Because how we do it, it is not simply a you have to write a personal statement and we interview you and then we decide if you're in or not. No, all of the students get to actually take a course, a 6 weeks course that is zero credit bearing, but they actually get to go through that class regardless of if they're admitted or not. And they fully understand that they're not admitted until that course is complete. And in that course, three different faculty, the first 3 weeks, teach them about the basics of counseling. The second 3 weeks, the student gets to show whether they have the capacity to obtain, master, and or be able to deliver that service, and have, more importantly, have the um, emotional maturity and judgment to be able to become a therapist or a counselor. And so, really, in short, it becomes a 6 week interview process whereby the student is engaged fully with faculty members. And at the end of that 6 weeks, the faculty members collectively, the three of them, make a decision as to whether or not admit a student or if that student may not be a good fit for our counseling graduate program. And so that's one of the ways I feel like we can remove some of those barriers for students who might otherwise have test anxiety, who might otherwise have the inability to prep for um, the GRE or some other type of a test, which we will be using to determine whether or not they're going to be successful in a field, when in fact that is not exactly what the um, purpose of those tests was ever aligned to be. Then we move into the next issue of barriers in higher education, which is a structural barrier, and that is access to technology. Obviously, as uh, technology grows, more and more universities, regardless of if they are brick and mortar type traditional universities or if they are the more advanced online universities, they all now require some sort of a technology. I don't know of a single university in the United States that does not require their students to type their papers in a Word document or a some sort of a wor- computer program, if you will. We all have to have now internet access to find our journals. Many of the peer reviewed empirical journals all live in an online format whereby you need to access them via technology and internet. And so I know of many, many, and Dr. Schumacher might speak about this in the second half of the session about the use of technology now in K through 12. I have nieces and nephews where the independent school districts required them to now have tablets or some sort of an iPad, and that's where their homework is sent to them on a daily basis. Again, for a family that may not have the financial ability to buy this technology, that becomes a burden. Or for a family that may not know how to navigate the technology, that becomes yet another burden. Even for our adult learners, and when we're talking about pedagogical standards, that becomes a barrier. I remember 7 or 8 years ago, I was teaching a psychology 101 class and it was a traditional university face to face, where I spoke about the requirements for the class. And I shared the email that I had if there were any questions and how the students were to submit their assignments through our learning management system. And I recall a lady, she was 76 years old, walked up after the class was done and came up to me and said, "Hey, professor, I know you were talking about all these different requirements that we have, and you said something about we need to email you. So, what's an email?" And I realized, wow, like she clearly was a first time student. And so I asked, I was like, have you never used an email? She was like, yeah, no, I don't know what's going on here. I'm completely lost. This is my first class. And I had always wanted to obtain a bachelor level education, but I never could, raising the kids. And my husband was ill. And now, after he's had bouts with cancer and he passed away, and now I finally want to achieve a lifelong goal of mine, um, which is to earn a bachelor's degree. And so that raised a flag for me that here is when sometimes we assume that technology, some pieces of it are just innately part of daily life. It's not so when we're talking about higher ed with adult learners. And so with that lady, I actually walked her to the campus learning labs and computer labs and had somebody teach her some of the foundational pieces that she needed to be able to even start a class. And then obviously she had to learn much more after that. But regardless, access to technology continues to be a major problem that we have. It's getting removed. And I know many, many universities are now offering assistance to many of their students who can't otherwise afford the technology that's necessary to access their learning management systems or classes. But that's one more to keep in mind. Lack of support system. So, as a counselor and as a therapist who has 15 years of clinical experience, I know that was one of the major pieces that I often had many um, students coming to me that were in college or university setting, struggling with depression, struggling with anxiety, struggling with past traumas of their life, and not being able to manage those as they move through this otherwise completely new territory that they had never walked before. They were the trailblazers in their family. Their parents had never gone through the college system or the higher education system in the US, so they could not be a support system for them. Many of their friends had chosen not to go to a university, and so They felt very alone and isolated in, well, what am I supposed to do? And oftentimes, support system becomes crucial in both maintaining motivation as well as giving the student the ability to move past the times where things get tough. And in therapy, oftentimes, that's the journey that we find ourselves in when the therapy process becomes difficult, is when you're most likely to lose the client. Ironically, that's the time when most of the change is going to happen for the client as well. And so that's where it becomes very crucial for the therapist to provide additional support to the client to ensure that they feel emotionally safe, that they feel um, protected, and they feel supported in that journey, right? And so that's one of the things. And I know this morning, Kelly Herman, our vice president of student access, was having a conversation about some of the things that we can do to provide that additional support. So, but, and again, many of you probably on this call are faculty members or teach in higher ed. So I would encourage you to continue to utilize empathy in the process of your teaching and not take that for granted, because there are many, many people that are first timers going through this education system. And while you might be experts in the journey, they may not be. And that lack of support system also serves as a major barrier to many of them. The next piece that I will bring up will highlight some of the areas such as instructional design, faculty support services, faculty teaching excellence centers, and such. So, oftentimes, there's a discrepancy that happens in our education system, especially in the US, and that is what we intend to teach the student in terms of the content or the topic of the um, necessary curriculum. And then there's the schooling process of the different formats and the different rigors and the different standards and the different obligations that the student feels, or the school rather feels that the student needs to highlight to them before they are able to get that piece of credential highlighting their overall education. There is a quote out there that is credited to Mark Twain, but it's originally not from Mark Twain. But regardless, it says, "Don't ever let schooling get in the way of education." And I really love that quote, and I try to bring it into my journey as a faculty member and recognize that the ultimate goal that the student has signed up for within your program, within your department, within your college, within your university, is to obtain an education and a career in a specific field. I know sometimes we get very passionate about different formatting, APA style, MLA style, Chicago, this, that, all of these at the end of the day are formats that are standardized to keep um, essentially the papers that the student writes in a same similar format, so all of us know where to find the abstract, all of us know where the discussion section is, all of us know where the research sections are, and so on and so forth. So while the formatting is absolutely crucial from a industry perspective, at the end of the day, for a student who's going through the education journey and wants to become their best uh, provider in whatever field it is, they may never use APA again. And I've become aware of that with medical students or uh, even therapists, that, while we beat into their system that they need to follow APA, and no, you didn't use two spaces, or it wasn't indented five spaces here, or 5 inches there, and 1 inch here, or it wasn't centered. At the end of the day, when they become a therapist, they're sitting on a stand, they're trying to save a life, they're on a crisis call. The APA format simply becomes a part of that schooling process. It is not a part of that education that they needed to be able to provide the life saving methods that they are employing. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do schooling, but I'm just saying let's not make the schooling process more important than the actual education that the student is striving for. I think sometimes those um, what we call rigor ends up becoming a barrier to many of the students who lose their motivation, who lose their passion because somebody put that schooling ahead of their education. And I recall actually this as a personal lived experience. I recall being in my doctoral program, and our professor at the beginning of every class would do a 5 question quiz that she administered first 5 minutes of the class. So if you weren't there for the first 5 minutes, you couldn't take the quiz, regardless of what the excuse for you being 5 minutes late is. And it covered the content from the previous class. So, and at that time, I was actually an instructional designer at the same university, and I was late to that class. So I didn't take the quiz. And because of that singular quiz, that ended up being the only class that I achieved a B in my entire doctoral program. And I don't know how the value systems worked, but I still to this day remember, and it left a bad taste in my mouth. That one simple quiz that I was 6 minutes late to a class caused one grade shift, which then changed my GPA from a 4.0 to a 3.96 or what have you. Now, again, mind you, it never mattered. Not a single client of mine ever asked me what my doctoral GPA was. Nobody ever cared, and nobody will ever care. But my point is that simple example could leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth to where they may discontinue the entire journey. I know, and I've had many students who are perfectionists, which again, it's one of those um, issues or challenges that I try to teach them. It's not good to be a perfectionist because you will fail at some point in life, and that might itself become a barrier for you. Um, so, and here's the funny end of that story. So, about 6 or 7 years after I'd graduated, that faculty member and I ended up becoming co-workers as faculty members at a different university. She had changed universities. I'd been hired as a core faculty member for the counseling program. And so it clearly was still in her mind. One day she pulled me over in a hallway and she was like, "Hey, Dean, it's been on my mind. I just need to apologize the way that I uh, gave you a B in that class." Now, I acted like I didn't remember what had happened or why she had given me a B or whatnot, even though I did. I wasn't trying to rub it in. But clearly, it left an impression on her because she knew it wasn't necessary. But for whatever reason, she was trying to act tough and she did it. Um, but I still appreciated the awareness she had 6 years later to apologize for it. I wouldn't have done that. So credit goes to her. So next, disability accessibility. So one of the other major things that becomes a barrier, and I know many people have talked about over the last 2 days, is in fact not only physical access but also emotional accessibility. Again, I just highlighted some of the need for um, support systems. I just highlighted some of the need for mental awareness, mental health of the student, but also, and as you've heard in many, many other sessions throughout the last day and a half, physical disabilities, whether it's eyesight, not being able to read something on a screen, whether it's using hyperlinks correctly so that a student that cannot hear the conversation can use closed captioning to actually read the material. All of those become huge uh, barrier removals. And one of the other things that I will highlight that capture the next 2 points is I've made it a point, and it's a passion of mine to travel the world. So far, I've traveled upwards of 41 countries. And, in some of those travels, if nothing else, it has taught me to not take for granted many of the things that we take for granted on a daily basis. I've been to countries where I've realized individuals with a physical disability are non existent. Not that they don't exist, but they are treated as though they don't exist. I walk a sidewalk that has potholes everywhere, that there is no uh, remnants of any sort of a care for somebody that might otherwise have a visual disability or a hearing disability. And it's just heartbreaking because that individual in that country cannot exist. Or They have to have somebody that literally takes them every single place. They cannot be a person on their own, which, by the way, makes me proud of our system and the care that we put in to ensure that we bring in individuals with disabilities, because they enhance our discourse, they enhance our process of life. I've been in countries where there is no language communication. I feel completely lost because they don't speak any of the language that I speak or pretend to speak. And so it becomes a huge barrier. And I know that that's become a situation many times in our country where we have students that are proficient enough in daily communication, but may not be proficient in professional writing, that may not be proficient in professional grammar to present a APA style format. And that I have had to step back from and recognize, you know what, if I have a Spanish speaking student who wants to become a counselor, who wants to become a therapist so that they can go and serve the Spanish speaking population, is it really necessary for me to force them to write beautiful English papers so that they can then go back to a Spanish speaking country and speak with their clients in Spanish? Again, it's the schooling versus the education, which is more important. And that those are some of the points I hope to create awareness through this discussion. Um, so, with that said, if we can move on to the next slide, please. All right. So, one of the other pieces that I wanted to talk about, now we've talked about several of the barriers that exist out here, but one of the things that, again, I want to highlight, and I don't know if many of you have read the book Sapiens, um, but it's a beautiful book that really captures the history of humanity from its beginnings all the way to now. And in it, the author talks about how, regardless of how we want to act like we are still very separate and different from one another, that the United States system is different than the UK system, that's different than the Chinese system, that's different from the African system, that's different from the South American system. At the end of the day, the trajectory of life is going in such a way that we are becoming a global uh, community, that access that we never used to have to one another. We used to have so many different worlds we lived in. If you were a Native American living in the Americas and somebody else was living in China, you probably would, in your entire lifetime, never know of the other's existence. That is not such anymore. Again, as I was highlighting, I mean, in my own travels, I've always been amazed by how fast you can travel around the world now with the ease to some of the areas that otherwise you could never get to. I've been to the couple of 100 miles from Antarctica, South Pole, and I've been to Iceland, and some of those areas you just could not get to with boats and ships and even cars trying to drive. Needless to say, there weren't always cars out there either. And so we now have global access. But with that global access, we now need global knowledge. No longer is it good enough for us to have local knowledge of what's going on in our community and then try to act or access knowledge from somewhere else in the world. I know the saying has always gone that the United States is a melting pot and that we all have melted together. Well, the more accurate depiction or the description of that is no longer a melting pot, because we have not melted together. We have not lost our individual identities, but it is rather a salad bowl. It's a mixed salad bowl that we have all retained our own individual identities, but we have enhanced that dish. So if you are a lettuce, you're still a lettuce. Lettuce didn't become a tomato, tomato didn't become a cucumber. We're all still there, but it's the richness of that entire experience that makes that salad a salad. Otherwise, it would just be a bowl of lettuce, and that's not very exciting, or maybe for some of you. But nevertheless, hopefully you get the point. And so, with that said, now that we need diversity, now that we have different viewpoints, it makes that experience much more rich. When we include people from different walks of life, from different languages, from different cultures, it brings in those lived experiences that we've never experienced before. And in the lifetime that we all have as individuals, we will never live long enough to experience every other person's path. So the only path or the only saving grace that we have is to learn from one another. Otherwise, we will only experience what we know and no more than that. There is a quote from St. Augustine that I really love and has become my motto in my travels is the world is a book and those who do not travel read only one page, right? And so with that quote, I also encompass diversity and the need to understand the many different layers of diversity that it captures. So culture, religion, gender, ethnicity, different walks of life, different age, different skills, different outlooks. So all of that is important in our education system, but it only works if we allow it to take shape in that process. So we can move on to the next one. And here I will leave some time for some discussion and question time. So let me turn it over and go to see if there's any questions. Dr. Santiago, do you know if there is any questions that I need to answer or any comments that have been posted?
We don't currently have any questions in the Q&A.
Okay, perfect.
Were there any in the chat that were caught? I didn't see any.
No, there are no questions in the QA at this time.
Good. All right. Well, I hope that doesn't mean everybody was put to sleep with my presentation. I hope that
Not at all.
the points were delivered clear enough to where there wasn't much question. But nevertheless, if you can go on to the next slide, I have left my email on there in case anybody wants to email me or start a dialogue. I'm always looking for different ways of connecting with different individuals in different realms of life, whether it's on a professional or otherwise, speaking engagements and that such thing. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm always happy to respond to any questions or comments or suggestions that there may exist. So with that said, I will pause and turn it over to our moderators and see where they want to take it.
Jane, you're up next.
I'm up next. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have everyone here. And I wanted to thank Dean for that presentation. I think you've identified some of the most critical barriers and structures that we hold up, those of us in higher ed. I want to introduce myself and perhaps lay out my intent for my portion of this presentation. I'd like to share, and the only thing I really have to share is my own journey towards becoming an inclusive leader. And I'd like to start out by introducing myself. I am a white Jewish woman who has been in executive leadership positions for a very, very long time. I became aware of the need for my own journey early on in my life. My father was a university professor at Michigan State and was very active in the civil rights movement. I remember welcoming folks like Andrew Young into our home and listening to very spirited conversations. So at the very core of who I am is my commitment to working on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I've tried to live my life that way as a leader and as a human being. So, I'd like to share some of the things that I've learned over the course of my personal journey, and then we are going to have some breakout rooms so that you folks can look at a real case that actually happened in K-12 and see how you might begin your journey or continue on your journey as a result of this case that we're going to discuss. So again, welcome. I'm really thrilled that you're all here, and And I don't mind questions that are coming in. So if any of the facilitators feel that we need to stop and address those, I'm happy to do it. So next slide, please. So today's agenda for my portion of the session is to talk a little bit about the concept of the ladder of awareness. It's an exercise that I'm continually challenging myself with, and I hope to offer that to you as well, so that wherever you are on this journey of looking at barriers that are in existence in your workplaces, in your personal growth, in your development as an inclusive leader, we can at least become aware of where we are on the ladder of awareness. I do have a short case study that is a real life situation, and I want to frame that in the culture in which I live. Many of you know that I live in the Hawaiian Islands, excuse me, which is an indigenous, has a large indigenous population that was actually overthrown by colonialism in the 1800s. And I want to talk a little bit, I'll frame my presentation, excuse me, in the context of culture and what that means as we develop as inclusive leaders. Pardon me for 1 second. Okay, and then after the case study gets presented, we'll have you in breakout rooms to really interact with one another, because the truth is we are not going to address the emotional or structural barriers that we have unless we're willing to have the courage to have those conversations. And then we'll all come back to the main room. Participants don't have to do anything. Our wonderful facilitators behind the scenes are going to be taking care of all of that for us. And then we'll come back to the whole group and have a brief conversation. What did you hear in your group conversation? What questions do you have at this point? So next slide, please. Thank you. I've always found it helpful to put some guidelines or agreements out there when we begin to have conversations about things that may not be comfortable for all. So the agreements that I'm asking from our participants today, and these are the ones that I use in groups that I work with in K-12, in charter schools here in the state of Hawaii, we agree to stay engaged. And what I mean by that is to put your cell phones to sleep for a while, let LinkedIn take a break. Whatever your distractions are at this moment, I'm going to ask that for the next 40 minutes or so, you agree and I agree to stay engaged in the conversation, even when it becomes uncomfortable. And the second agreement is tied into that. You are going to experience discomfort. In order to remove barriers, in order to remove our emotional ability to grow as inclusive leaders, we are going to experience discomfort. And what I'll ask of all of us is that we be willing to ride that out. Here in Hawaii, we surf, and the image of falling off your board, but knowing you're going to be okay, is something that I can use as an analogy. We are going to become uncomfortable because we're going to go deep as much as we can in 40 minutes or so and really explore ourselves. The third agreement is I'm going to ask that we suspend our assumptions. And by that, I mean that we hold our assumptions out for other people to see. It's sort of like a spider that's dropping down from a thread of its web. We have to hold our own assumptions out for other people to see so that they know what our perspectives are. But we also have to agree to put aside our own assumptions about others that are speaking. Monitor the assumptions that you hear in your head and agree to just set those aside for the rest of this session and just listen openly and actively. And then the final agreement is that we agree to listen to the perspectives of others first and to speak second. That's something that I had to learn when we moved to the Hawaiian Islands over 20 years ago. Here, what's important to us is that we know who you are, and the only way we can do that is by listening to you first instead of sharing who we think we are or responding on top of somebody else's conversation. So I just ask that we all agree to hold to those 4 agreements as we go through this session, and that we think about how we can develop agreements for folks in our own work as we attempt to dismantle some of those structural barriers that are present in K-12 schools. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to talk for a moment about some of the barriers that we experience in K-12 education in terms of becoming inclusive leaders and looking at learning but unlearning, because all of us live in a society where, for example, race is a social construction. And we have to look at some of the structures that are in place in K-12 schools that we may not have thought about before. I've thought about just a couple of examples from my own experience, and I'd like to share those. I was a grant director at one point in my career. Our school had received a multi-million-dollar grant to include Head Start programming, which is early childhood programming for low-income families, into our elementary schools. So the school itself was we worked with families from birth, we met them in the hospitals, to age 8. And it was a non-graded, multi-age school in which we really addressed the needs of families and children. When I became principal of that school, I walked in the building the very first day. I'll never forget. It was October 13th. There was a sign hanging above the secretary's desk that said, "I don't speak Spanish. If you can't speak English, I can't help you." I can remember sort of holding my breath and thinking, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? The structural barrier of welcoming some children and families, but not others, was something that hadn't been addressed, and that really frustrated me. So that's example 1 of a barrier. Example 2, in that same district, we had a river running through the 9 communities that the district served. Essentially, what that river did was divide the haves and the have-nots in our district. We had one magnet school that mixed populations from either side of the river, but the very presence of that geographic feature, the Fox River, was marked in this district, where the children whose families lived in McMansions were on one side of the river. The children who lived in multifamily homes with 12 to 15 folks living in a 3-bedroom house was on the other side of the river. Structurally, could we have changed that? Yes, if we had the will to do so. Didn't happen, but we could have. Another barrier in that situation was that students were either suspended or expelled based on their last names. I argued to have suspension and expulsion cases dealt with by number. That was not acceptable as a practice. And so children whose last names happen to be Jones or Rodriguez or Garcia tended to be expelled or suspended more than children who had white last names. Another structure to dismantle. The structure that I found the most shocking and needed to be dismantled right away was we were serving families from extremely low income. We had families living in cars, we had families living in tents, we had families living in federal housing projects. We That was our student and family population. But what we were asking our children to do was to conform to traditional practices and structures in schooling. And what we found was that we had to change our school and the way we functioned in order to serve the children that we got. These are the children we have. We cannot force them into a structure that does not work for them. So that was a major barrier to work on. Another barrier that we've experienced is hiring only monolingual families. Hiring only monolingual staff. We had a 79% Latinx population, and yet most of the staff and faculty in this particular school were English speaking, mostly white women. That needed to be changed. We had to remove that structure of and look at our entire recruiting and hiring practices. And then finally, no, not finally, I have one more, not understanding the culture in which we live. And that's part of the case that I've put together. Life in the Hawaiian Islands is radically different than life on the continent. Um, Folks from the continent that come to Hawaii to live here have to understand the perspectives of the indigenous population here in order to deeply understand why white children, particularly in middle school, are bullied simply for being white. There's a lot of anger in the indigenous population here in the Hawaiian Islands that if you don't understand the history of Hawaii, you have not done your homework. As I said, here in the Hawaiian Islands, it's more important to know who you are before we assess and want to hear about what you know. So that personal connection needs to be built, and this anonymity and being out of touch with your community and the values of the community is an emotional and a structural barrier. Finally, in my journey towards becoming an inclusive leader, a structure both emotionally and physically, really, that can be addressed and must be addressed is our ability to know ourselves as leaders. Have we really taken the time to dig down deep and to look at where we are on this ladder? The ladder looks at 4 different levels that we're going to address today in this presentation. And we start down at the bottom here, the bottom rung. And the first place that folks tend to start on the breaking through those emotional and structural barriers, quite frankly, is being unaware that they even exist. We are so acculturated in this country, in our public school system, that we may not even be aware that there are structures in place that need to be removed, that need to make it safe for all of us, our faculty and staff, our leaders, our families, our students, to feel safe in the environment in which we are living and working. There are lots of folks who have not yet started their own personal journey, and therefore they're not quite aware that there are structures and barriers that can be reduced to make our systems, our K-12 systems, safe for everyone. The next step up on the ladder is becoming aware. When we first, as individuals, open our eyes and become exposed to, wait a minute, you're telling me that this is something that is preventing from the full participation of our families or our students. When we become aware of that, it's a very, very emotionally upsetting time for many folks, especially for white folks. We may feel guilty, we may feel embarrassed, we may feel shame. All of those are natural, and it goes back to why I'm asking that we hold to those agreements. I'm going to give you an example of what this might look like when we first become aware. When I was a school principal, I had a staff that said, you know what, let's put on a workshop for our families on how to read aloud to their children. So we came up with this great, publicity campaign and sent it out and put it in doorways and left it at local currency exchanges and so on. I really, really want to thank Felicia, who is a mom that I will remember my entire life. She came to school with the flyer in her hand, shaking it, saying, "You folks don't get us at all. Don't be teaching me how to read out loud to my children when I'm trying to make my checks from the government last for a month, so I don't have to choose between getting my child's asthma medication or feeding my family. Teach us how to do that." So we went back and really restructured. That was the first time as a white woman that I had ever heard somebody be uncomfortable with what we thought was offering a wonderful service. That was a period of true disruption in our faculty and staff. But we worked through it. And as we moved into the acceptance stage, we really had to examine our collective assumptions as a staff, as a faculty, and as individuals. Do we accept that we have the children we have, and we have to turn our own paradigms upside down? We have to listen to the families we have and honor them and help them live a dignified life when they're within the walls of our school. When we moved into action, one of the first things that we did is we brainstormed a list of what do our families really need. That happened because I required our entire faculty of 92 people. We rented 3 school buses, arranged for those buses to take our entire faculty on a tour of all of the neighborhoods that we served. We got out, we walked around the neighborhoods, we got back on the bus, and we talked. What did we see? What did we observe? What did we not know? And decided that we needed to move into action. Many of our children would come to school on Monday morning in clothing that smelled of urine because they had 3 or 4 young children sleeping in one bed. Our children came to school hungry. And we moved into action. We got grants for providing breakfast, lunch, and after school snacks for our children. We opened a family education center where within that we had a family, we called it our family center. We had donations of gently used clothing so that the first thing we could do with our children when they came in the school on Monday morning, we had a washer and dryer. They could put their clothing in the washer and dryer, take something from the neighborhood closet to wear until their clothes were ready at the end of the day. We wanted our children to feel that they were worthy of being there, that we valued them as human beings, and we did the same thing for our families. So moving up that ladder from being unaware of the needs of our community to becoming aware, accepting, and then moving into action was the way that we approached working with removing some of those barriers and structures. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, I hope you can see this. Could we make it any larger? Casey or
There isn't a way to zoom in. No, I'm sorry.
Okay, there isn't. Okay, so I guess I'll do what I hate doing, and I'll read this to you. Um, this chart talks about what our mental map might be when we're in each of these stages, what it may sound like, and what the message is delivering to folks that we are working with. So let's start first with being unaware from that ladder. Our mental map, when we're unaware, is that we are thinking in our very tiny, socially constructed boxes, and we're not thinking outside those boxes in order to even know that we need to make changes in removing barriers and dealing with the emotions of it. It may sound like, well, at my last school, we did it this way, or, oh, I know, it's the same with me and where I come from. Now, what's being heard is, I don't matter, my thoughts don't matter, and they're just going to do what they do and expect my child and my family to fit into that. So that unaware stage is being aware that we're unaware and having an experience like Felicia coming into my office and talking about what she really needed. That might open the door to my becoming more aware. When I move to the awareness level, my mental map is going to be that I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I'm justifying or rationalizing why the school is the way it is, or why the K-12 district the way that it is the way that it is. We may start to experience guilt and shame, as I discussed before. What that might sound like is, you know what, I'm just not ready to have that conversation. Our staff isn't ready. Well, guess what? We're never ready, because a lot of us have the will, but not the courage to do what it takes to change barriers and structures. We might justify and say, oh gosh, the reason I said that was. Um, so that's what it may sound like, but the message that's being heard by the people that are listening to us is, you know what, we're avoiding that topic. I am not going there. That's going to be something that we're just not talking about. Or it's saying, you know what, what's being heard is, here's why you're wrong and here's why I'm right. And that will not help in removing structures. When we move into acceptance, our mental map is learning that we have to unlearn some of what we think we know. That puts us in a very vulnerable position, but it challenges our own thinking, so that personally we have to change first. And we have to begin that journey of seeing the barriers, believing the people that are telling us that there are barriers and structures emotionally or physically in the district. It might sound like, let me think about why I said that. For example, I was out to lunch with a dear friend. I'm white, Jewish. She is African American and Catholic. We went out to lunch and I ordered because she wasn't ready yet. And the clerk looked at me and said, "And what would your friend like?" And my answer was, "Gosh, I'm wondering why you don't ask her." And it was really the first time that I felt that standing as an ally was important and could break some emotional barriers that the clerk was feeling, but also addressing my friend. When I came back and started challenging gently with staff and families, I found that I was learning new behaviors and I had to be open to that. When I moved to Hawaii, I was all about, here's what I can do. I was on the national consultation circuit. I was traveling to different states every day of my life. Nobody cared here in the Hawaiian Islands. What they wanted to know is, who are you? And I would be asked, where did you grad? And I thought, well, my doctorate's from National Louis University. And I had a Hawaiian mentor who said to me, we don't care about that. We want to know who's your auntie's cousin's friend that I might be able to know so that we can find a connection. So being able to unlearn and gradually learn first is a way that we can address that. It might sound like I'm going to be asked to explain my own race, my own ethnicity, my own culture, my own sexual orientation, again, to teach you what I had to unlearn. So we have to be willing to make ourselves vulnerable. But the message that we may be portraying is, I don't want to teach you. People of color, people with disabilities, people with sexual orientations not of mine, um, are weary. And they're weary because they've had 1,000 microaggressions and little tiny cuts at their self esteem all day and shouldn't be asked, what do you think I should do to become anti whatever, racist, whatever? It's our journey, folks. It's not asking folks who are marginalized and oppressed in our society anyway what we need to do. The work is on us. So, moving into action, our mental maps need to be modeling humility. I don't know everything. I am open to learning. I realize things that I've said in the past that I was unaware of. But we have to be willing as inclusive leaders to step up and say, I didn't know that. And here's how I've started learning. We have to be willing to try out what we're learning and make mistakes along the way because that's how we learn. What it may sound like is, when I began to unlearn what I thought about X, it helps give permission to other folks to begin this journey. What's being heard is, oh my gosh, they're trying to change and it's about time. So there's recognition that that I'm working to become an ally for people who have been marginalized their entire lives. It's met sometimes with a bit of, are they really going to do this work? But that's okay, because at least we're moving into action. So again, those 4 steps, what I want to share is that all of that we have to go through as inclusive leaders before we can begin to talk about inclusivity, belonging, equity, diversity. We have to be willing to start that journey for ourselves. And as leaders, we have to be willing to share our own journeys before we're ready to lead anybody else. It's that internal exploration of our assumptions. So I really hope that you see how that ladder of awareness needs to live inside of each of us first, and then we can begin to share it out with the folks that we're leading. Next slide, please. I wanted to ask us all to just to take a moment and jot down what you are thinking at this point in this presentation. What thoughts are you having? Where do you see yourselves on this ladder? And I'm asking you to be honest and transparent. And just take a moment to put your thoughts either in paper and pencil if you'd prefer to have that conversation with yourselves, or you can drop them into the chat room. And I'm going to give us a couple of minutes just to take time and evaluate ourselves. So I'll give us about a minute. And I'm just going to go silent here for a little bit to let you process what you've heard so far. Donald said, it's accurate from my experience of family interaction in a Head Start environment. If they don't know me, they don't really trust me. And Donald is additionally examining himself. He finished that statement by saying, especially as I'm the only man in my school. That's an amazing perspective, Donald, and I really thank you for that. He also said stripping the self of pretense and becoming vulnerable to the population we serve. Absolutely right on. Other thoughts in the chat? Silence is uncomfortable, isn't it? Cynthia says we need to ask questions about others because we might make assumptions. Hang on one second. Assumptions about their experience and what they need or want. Regina says, I see myself as someone who's willing to help someone who truly wants to climb the ladder. Thank you for that, Regina. As an African-American woman, she says, I believe the work is from within and you either want to do the work or not. And that is so true. Nobody can be forced to do the work, but I'm telling you, it changed my life when I began that journey. I thought I was pretty open, but I've learned a lot since I started the journey. So thank you for those thoughts. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to read this case study out loud, so I hope I make it interesting. This is actually a situation that I'm living with right now in a K-12 setting. I am co-chair of a school board of a public charter school here in the Hawaiian Islands. This is a case that is so timely because this is my other full-time job. I get done at work and then I go work on this school board situation. But here's what we're experiencing right now. And I used some of the examples from what we're dealing with, and then we're going to ask you all to go into breakout rooms and talk about this as we view it from the ladder of unaware, aware, acceptance, and action. So here's the case. This is Hau'oli K-12 public school. Dr. Garner, the new principal of Hau'oli School, is meeting with the school leadership team. The team currently is made up of grade level lead faculty members and 3 assistant principals. 5 members of that team have raised concern about several issues that have been discussed in their grade level meetings. These issues that have arisen include, number 1, that the very spelling of the name of the school is incorrect in Hawaiian language or Alelo Hawaii. In Hawaiian language, we have diacritical marks that separate. So the word Hau'oli, you can there's an okina or a sort of a single quotation mark. And what that signals is that there's a break between the first part of the word and the second part of the word. However, the very name of the school is misspelled because there's no okina. What that says to me is somebody needs to increase their awareness of Alelo Hawaii or Hawaiian language. So that's one issue. Second, we're dealing with the issue came up that talking over staff members as they try and express their opinions is occurring. So someone will start a conversation, but immediately the new principal says, oh, I had that in my old school, and here's what we did. That's not a practice that we do here in the Hawaiian Islands. Respectfully listening first and talking second is an issue that was occurring in this school. Third issue that has surfaced is that multiple sets of instructional materials that are being called curriculum are culture blind. There are no examples of Hawaiian children. There are no examples from Hawaiian legend or folklore. They're culture blind, just as many of our instructional materials on the continent are color blind. And the fourth issue that the faculty and the leadership team is bringing up is that this particular school has completely eliminated a statewide Hawaiian curriculum initiative called Nahopena A'o, which is a statewide framework that all of our schools must use to build the awareness of the culture in which we live. But that statewide framework has been eliminated from the school and is being called irrelevant and unnecessary. So again, the four issues are the spelling of the name of the school correctly, leaders talking over staff members. Third is instructional materials that are culture blind and are not relevant here in the Hawaiian Islands. And fourth, eliminating the very curriculum that could help our students, staff, faculty, and families become aware of the culture in which we live. Those are the four issues. So next slide, please. What we're going to ask you to do is that we are breaking into small group conversations where we'd like you to have a conversation in this small group about the situation at Hau'oli School and how those 4 steps to inclusive leadership that we found on that ladder might be experienced by the faculty and staff, by school leaders, by board members, by students. How are these emotional and structural barriers being viewed and addressed through the lens of that ladder? Do you see any of those particular issues that are being brought up? Where are they on that ladder of our learning to become inclusive leaders and in our families' understanding that we're really working on learning and unlearning? So in your small group, you might take the perspective of family and staff. Somebody else could take the perspective of board member, of the student, of families. But what we'd like you to do is think about that case that was just presented, have a conversation in your small group breakout rooms, and we'll give you about 15 minutes to have those conversations. And then at the end of that 15-minute period, we'll all rejoin in the large room and debrief. We'd like to learn about what those conversations brought out in your groups and see if there are follow-up questions that we can answer for everybody. So you will automatically be put into breakout groups. You'll automatically be returned to the large group. So the magic workers behind the scenes here, Casey and Lilia, if you could get us into small groups at this point, that would be great.
And before we do that, thank you so much, Dr. Schumacher and Dr. Slinia, for your presentations. We are coming closer to our time to end, so our breakout rooms won't be as long, but I still would like to do them. They will only be shorter. We'll probably do them for 5 to 7 minutes. So let's aim for 5. I don't know that we'll get through everything, but at least it'll give everyone an opportunity to sort of take the scenario in and really maybe begin to have that conversation, begin to think about how that conversation can happen. So I know that we are 5 after 12 right now, if my clock is correct. So if we could give the breakout room 5 minutes and then return. Once we return, there is one question in the QA that I'd like to ask to Dr. Aslania, and then we'll move on to the next steps.
Great.
So Casey,
thank you, Dr.
breakout
Santiago.
rooms. Thank you very much.
You should be taken to your breakout room soon.
Thank you.
Yep.
the time was much too short for us. We were having a
Way too short.
conversation in my segment. So
Yeah.
we have a
Yeah.
couple of things to bring up. So
Please
let's
go ahead.
I don't know if everyone was able to return, but two of the participants, Sonia and Janet, in the session that I was in,
Mhm.
Sonia took the parents' viewpoint and said, it's similar to an experience that she's having in her homeschool where, the system and the leadership doesn't understand their perspective. And so she's had to pull her kids out of school
Mhm.
because of that misunderstanding in the system. And Janet made an interesting point about how she took the staff position in that scenario that you gave, Jane, and she mentioned that it goes back to how the staff was trained in their own programs that then
Right.
prepared them for where they were. And I think that is an interesting topic. I know we are at time. I would encourage our participant to just take that scenario and take that information that you've learned and really think through that scenario and put yourself in those different positions to see where you are in that ladder in place of, are you aware? Are you taking action? Are you at a point where you could stand up and advocate or be that person? So it's very important that those things happen. I think when we talk about the emotional and structural barriers, we have seen the emotional barriers and the structural barriers. Virginia asks a very important question early on after Dean presentation, is that yes, we know that they are here, that those emotional and structural barriers are here and they're here to stay. How do we even begin to address them? And
Yeah.
so, Jane, you gave us some ideas of how we can internalize some of those things, but I'm going to ask Dean to give us that response to that one question. I know we had quite a few questions, but we are at time, and I want to make sure we get that one in.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. I think this is one of the ways. I think starting this conversation, creating the awareness, and continuing to bring up the points with those that otherwise don't think about them is the most simple way that we can address it. We need to destigmatize these conversations. These conversations need to be continuously had. So I'm glad we had it at this level, but now let's each one of us take it back to where we are and incorporate it into our individual settings. I think that that is how it's going to finally change. So
Definitely. Jane, any last comments? This was a great presentation. Both of you really gave us some things to think about. And the participants, the audience in this section were really great at sharing their ideas. I know that each of you had a breakout room and some great things happened in those breakout rooms. I apologize. We didn't have the chance to do that, but thank you so much for attending the session. Thank you so much for being willing to have those conversations. The fact that you are here in this session mean that you are ready to have those conversations or at least think through those things. So please go back to your respective places, engage in conversations, begin those dialogue if you haven't done so. And if you are having them, continue to have them and continue to invite people to have them with you. Beyond that, I want to thank you very much for attending this session. Thank you to our presenters. Very good information to share with us and lots to think about. Food for thoughts here.
I would just end with asking participants, do you have the will and the courage to become an inclusive leader? Because it takes both. So thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Casey, any announcements?
Thank you guys all for joining this session. Now we're going to the networking lunch session. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you should see a little handshake that says networking. It puts you in one-on-one chat with another individual that's in this conference or this summit for us. We have that. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll be back on the main stage. Thanks, guys.
Thank
you all.
Thanks, Felicia. Thanks, Casey.
thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Dean.
You're welcome. Bye.